Now, the ego, which is a mind-made sense of self, a mind-made identity that consists of narratives, thoughts that you identify with. The earliest story about the rising of the ego is the myth of Narcissus. This is, of course, where the word narcissism comes from. And every ego has very strong narcissistic elements to it. The story of Narcissus is there was a young man, very beautiful, in ancient Greece. And this young man, because it was a time before mirrors were invented and before we had the wonderful invention of selfies, he had never seen himself. And one day he looked into a pool of water and he saw his own reflection. And he was so fascinated by his own reflection. The story says that he fell in love with himself, but my interpretation is really that he became obsessed with himself, but not with himself, with the image of himself. And after that, he was no longer a happy person. There are various versions of that story, but his life didn't go well after that. So that, I believe, there's sometimes very deep wisdom embodied in mythology, in myth. It really, what it points to is the arising of the human ego, which is a kind of phantom self that you carry around, that you mistake for who you actually are. It consists of identifications with possessions, identification with your own body, including, of course, the color of your skin. It's part of your own body. Identification with things that you can do, abilities, things you know. Now, what does it mean, identification with? It means you derive your sense of self from something that is not you. So let's say it's my car. And it could start for a little child who gets a toy car. And so the child is given a toy car, and that's the beginning of the ego, is the feeling of the child, this is mine. So there's a certain identification with the toy, a self-identification. So it enhances, because it only works if another child does not have that toy, then it really works. This is my car. So it enhances a certain sense of identity. And identity is something that humans desperately seek after meeting the needs of food and shelter. One could almost say the next thing after that is the psychological need in human beings for a sense of identity. And the first thing that humans do, and there's no preventing this, they seek an identity by identifying with this, that, or the other. Later, the adult may have a car and derives part of their sense of identity from having this car, but it only works because it's compared. The ego is comparative, the image in your mind of who you are. It only works because other people don't have it. So imagine you have a Rolls Royce and it enhances your sense of self. Every time you look at it, you sit in it, you are seen by other people. It enhances your identity, your sense of self. Now imagine a scenario where, let's say there's a kind of a twilight zone. Suddenly you wake up in a reality where every human being at the age of 20 is given the same Rolls Royce. Everybody drives exactly the same Rolls Royce. Suddenly it would no longer serve to enhance your identity because you have nothing to compare itself to, because the ego needs, ultimately it seeks some kind of superiority. It compares itself to others in one way or another. It seeks some kind of superiority over others. It's an unconscious process. There's always an unease behind it because the ego never feels really at ease or fulfilled. There's always an underlying sense of lack, of insufficiency, of not enough. I am not enough. Because ultimately it's only a mental image that you mistake for who you are. It's often associated with a narrative in your mind that tells you about my life. You call it my life. Me and my life. This is me. This is my life. People have a relationship with themselves. Isn't that strange? They have a relationship with them. So this is why you have to... I hate myself. I love myself. In both cases, it's better to love yourself than to hate yourself. But in both cases, there's a duality. There's a split that has happened. There's you, and there's a self that you either hate or love. So the question is, if there is the self that you either hate or love, who are you? Who is the one that hates or loves that self? What is going on here? The dog does not have that problem because the dog has not arrived yet at ego. The dog has no self-image. The animal does not yet have an ego. So the dog is itself. The dog has no problem with body image or self-esteem because the dog is, and this is why most animals are more joyous than, less problematic than humans. They do not carry the weight of the self, what the Buddha called the self. One of the main teachings of the Buddha is to recognize the unreality of the self, that it is a mental construct that you mistake for who you are. So ultimately, the ego, then the essence of ego, you could say, is complete identification with thoughts. So, and the recurring thoughts in your mind that tell you who you are, that's the ego. And for people who are unconscious of that, they are so in the grip of these thought forms that they are virtually asleep. There's nobody there other than the dream of thought, the phantom self. So waking up means to suddenly recognize that the thoughts that go through your head continuously, but also the emotions that reflect those thoughts, are not who you are. So even the first beginning of awakening, spiritual awakening, one could say, is to recognize that certain thoughts are continuously arising in your mind. And you, for a moment, you have stepped out of that and you recognize. It's a stepping back, one could say. Underneath it all, there's this vast realm of conscious presence. There is a presence there, without which you wouldn't be able to perceive anything, you wouldn't be able to think anything. It's a little bit like, I compare it sometimes to, before you live on the surface of the ocean, you're a little ripple on the surface of the ocean. And this ripple only knows itself as a ripple. And it looks at other ripples and sometimes feels threatened by other ripples or wants to use other ripples to enhance its own sense of self. And it's always fearful. It always compares itself to other ripples. A very unpleasant and frustrating way to live. It hasn't realized the depth of its being because the ripple is only a temporary expression of the vastness of the ocean. But it doesn't know that. So if the ripple for a moment comes to us, if the continuous thought, in this analogy, the ripple, of course, is the human being, and the ripple, when the ripple stops thinking for a moment, and this is the key, for a moment, you come to a cessation of the stream of thinking. And what's left when you're not thinking about your history, your personal history, or the future? You're just becoming aware of this moment, yourself, this moment. But what is that self? It's no longer the historical self. You can't say very much about it. There is an underlying sense of presence, of alive, conscious presence. It's still, it's alive. The awakening can begin with realizing that you are not the thoughts that go through your mind. That's the beginning. Now, what has arisen at that moment? Awareness. Suddenly, you realize that there is a dimension of consciousness in you that's not thinking, but just conscious. And that is your essence identity. To be rooted in that, it's ultimately very simple. I don't know why they don't teach that at school. I mean, the most important life lesson is the transcendent dimension of life, of who you are. To find all the ancient teachings, using different terms and different words, they all point to this possibility of realizing the transcendent dimension of who you are. Whether the Buddha actually calls it, the translation is sunyata, emptiness, but the better translation would be spaciousness. That's the essence of who you are, sunyata, spaciousness. Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, which in my translation is not, kingdom I translate it as dimension, and heaven, which is the vast, heaven when you look up at the sky, that's the closest thing you can get to spaciousness in the sense-perceived world. The closest thing you can get to spaciousness is to look at the vastness of the sky or heaven. In many languages, heaven and sky is the same word. So you look at the vastness of sky, which is vast spaciousness. So the kingdom of heaven is the dimension of spaciousness. It's a dimension of consciousness. This is why then they asked Jesus, where is the kingdom of heaven? When is it going to come? And he said, the kingdom of heaven cannot come with signs to be perceived. You can never say it's over here or it's over there, because the kingdom of heaven is within you. In fact, he was saying it is the essence of who you are. Consciousness is, but it's not only the essence of who you are, it's the essence of the universe itself, because you are just a microcosm of the universe. So when you realize the essence of who you are, the universe is realizing its own essence through you, this little thing, through you.